May 1945. A British parachute regiment lieutenant boards a captured U-boat in Wilhelmshaven harbour. The crew has surrendered, but something is wrong. A smell leads him below deck to a sealed compartment. Inside, chained to pipes, lies a German sailor, emaciated, barely breathing. A crude sign hangs around his neck. Deserter. But this man never left his post. He was locked away by his own commander. What the lieutenant discovers challenges everything he knows about enemy and ally, duty and brutality, and the invisible war fought inside the steel coffins beneath the Atlantic. The harbour at Wilhelmshaven stank of oil and surrender. Lieutenant James Thornton stood on the concrete pier at precisely 14:30 hours on the 8th of May, 1945, watching German submariners file off U-1023 with their hands clasped behind their heads. The war in Europe had ended 3 days earlier, but the machinery of victory still turned. U-boats were being catalogued, crews interrogated, vessels inspected for intelligence value before being scuttled or claimed as prizes. Thornton, 26 years old from Aldershot, was not supposed to be here. Parachute regiment officers belonged in occupied towns and liberated camps, not boarding enemy submarines. But the Naval Intelligence Section needed someone who could translate technical German quickly. And Thornton, whose mother had been a Bremen schoolteacher before the Great War, was the only man available within 50 miles who could read Kriegsmarine documentation without a dictionary. The U-boat's commander, Kapitänleutnant Werner Braun, stood ramrod straight on the pier despite 3 months at sea, his uniform still pressed, his face expressionless. 43 German sailors had disembarked. The crew manifest listed 44. When Thornton asked about the discrepancy, Braun's jaw tightened. "One man died at sea," he said in clipped English. "Burial conducted per naval regulation, 16th of April, position classified." Something in Braun's tone made Thornton's instincts prickle. He had spent the last year interrogating Wehrmacht officers in Normandy, Belgium, and the Rhineland. He knew evasion when he heard it. "I'll need the death certificate and burial log," Thornton said quietly. Braun's expression did not change, but his knuckles whitened as he clenched his hands behind his back. The U-boat's interior was a claustrophobic nightmare. Pipes, valves, bunks, stacked 3 high, the pervasive smell of diesel, unwashed bodies, and something else, something organic and wrong. Thornton moved through the control room with Lieutenant Commander Hugh Garrett, a Royal Navy officer who had spent the war hunting these very boats from corvette bridges. Garrett pointed out torpedo-loading mechanisms, periscope housings, the Enigma machine still bolted to its table, but Thornton kept smelling that wrong smell. It grew stronger as they moved aft, past the galley where pots still sat in cold grease, past the crew quarters where pornographic photographs were pinned to bulkheads, past the diesel engine room where oil pooled in the bilge. The smell was decay, but not mechanical decay. It was human. "There," Thornton said, stopping at a sealed hatch with a steel wheel lock. The smell emanated from behind it. Garrett frowned. The compartment was marked Ersatzteillagerraum, spare parts storage. But the wheel had been welded shut from the outside, crude bead welds, still showing file marks where someone had tried to smooth them. "This isn't standard," Garrett said. "Damage control hatches are never permanently sealed. If there's flooding, you need access." Thornton called for a cutting torch. It took 20 minutes to slice through the welds. 20 minutes during which the smell intensified until both men were breathing through their sleeves. When the hatch finally swung open, they found hold 3. The compartment was 2 meters wide, 4 meters long, with a ceiling so low Thornton had to crouch. A single electric bulb, long dead, hung from a cable. The deck was covered in human waste, vomit, and something worse. And chained to the vertical pipe running floor to ceiling, his wrists bound with rusted shackles, was what had once been a man. He was alive, barely. His eyes were sunken so deep they seemed like holes in his skull. His cheeks had collapsed inward. His naval uniform hung off a frame that weighed perhaps 5 stone. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and when he saw the light from the open hatch, he made a sound. Not quite a word, not quite a scream, just a desperate animal noise that came from somewhere beyond language. Around his neck hung a piece of cardboard on a string, written in neat official script, "Deserteur." Garrett vomited. Thornton did not. He had seen Belson 3 weeks earlier, had walked through piles of corpses that had once been human beings. But this was different. This man had not been murdered by ideology or industrial efficiency. He had been murdered by his own commander, slowly, methodically, locked in darkness, while his crewmates walked past the sealed hatch day after day, eating their rations, listening to his screams until he no longer had the strength to scream. Thornton knelt beside the man and spoke in German. "You're safe now. We're British. The war is over." The man's eyes focused on Thornton's face, and tears began to run down his wasted cheeks. He tried to speak, but his throat produced only a rasping whisper. Thornton leaned closer. Ich wollte nicht kämpfen. I did not want to fight. The medics came with bolt cutters and morphine. The shackles came off, leaving deep infected grooves in the man's wrists. His body temperature was dangerously low. His pulse was weak and irregular. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, something fell from his pocket. A photograph, creased and stained, showing a young woman holding a baby in front of a Hamburg bakery. On the back, in faded pencil, "Greta und Klaus, Weihnachten 1943. Thornton climbed back onto the pier and walked directly to Kapitän Leutnant Braun, who was smoking a cigarette under guard. Braun saw Thornton's expression and straightened, as if preparing for inspection. "Where is Seaman Second Class Friedrich Weber?" Thornton asked. His voice was very quiet, very controlled. Braun's face remained impassive. "He attempted desertion in port, 14th of April. Naval law requires severe punishment. I exercise my authority as commander. You locked him in a sealed compartment and starved him to death while continuing combat operations. He was a coward and a traitor. Kriegsmarine discipline." Thornton hit him. He knew he shouldn't. He was an officer of His Majesty's forces, bound by Geneva Convention regulations regarding treatment of prisoners. But his fist connected with Braun's jaw anyway, and the German commander went down hard on the concrete, blood streaming from his split lip. Guards pulled Thornton back. Garrett appeared and quietly ordered Thornton to report to the intelligence section for debriefing. That night, Thornton sat in a requisitioned Wilhelmshaven office and wrote his report by the light of a paraffin lamp. The words came with difficulty. How did one describe systematic torture carried out not in a camp, not in a cellar, but inside a military vessel operating under the code of naval warfare? How did one explain that 43 German sailors had lived and worked and eaten their meals, while Friedrich Weber slowly died of thirst and starvation less than 10 meters away? The British Army medical officer's preliminary report arrived at 2300 hours. Weber was alive but critical. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, infected wounds, likely permanent kidney damage. He had been locked in Hold 3 for at least 24 days. He would not speak, except to repeat over and over in delirium, "I only wanted to go home. I only wanted to see my son." Thornton's hands shook as he finished the report. He had fought from Normandy to the Baltic, had seen men die in every conceivable way, had accepted that war meant death. But this was something different. This was what happened when military discipline became indistinguishable from murder, when obedience to authority meant collaborating in the death of a shipmate, when the machinery of war consumed its own. The question that haunted him as he sealed the report was simple and terrible. How many other Friedrich Webers had died in holds and compartments across the German military, punished not by the enemy, but by their own commanders for the crime of being human? The investigation began at dawn on the 9th of May. Thornton was assigned to lead the interrogation team, working alongside Royal Navy intelligence officers and a Judge Advocate General's representative who would determine if Braun faced war crimes charges. The setting was a converted German naval barracks in Wilhelmshaven. its walls still bearing Kriegsmarine propaganda posters showing heroic U-boat crews sinking Allied merchantmen. The first challenge was the crew's absolute silence. Of the 43 men who had walked off U-1023, not one would speak about Friedrich Weber. They sat in interrogation rooms with their hands folded, their faces blank, responding to questions with regulation name, rank, and serial number. Even the youngest sailors, boys of 17 and 18, who had been conscripted in the war's final desperate months, maintained perfect discipline. When Thornton asked Oberbootsman Klaus Richter, the senior petty officer, what he knew about the sealed compartment, Richter looked straight ahead and said nothing. The code of silence was not surprising. Kriegsmarine discipline was legendary, enforced through a system of punishment that made British naval tradition look gentle by comparison. German submariners were taught from their first day of training that the boat came before the individual, that survival depended on absolute obedience, that any weakness endangered the entire crew. Desertion, even attempted desertion, was the ultimate betrayal, and the punishment was death. But what Braun had done exceeded even Kriegsmarine standards. Thornton began collecting technical documentation, the boat's log, damage control reports, personnel records. He found the entry for 14th April, 48 hours before U-1023 departed Trondheim on what would be its final patrol. The log noted, Seaman 2nd Class F. Weber, confined per Article 71, Kriegsmarine Disciplinary Code, pending court-martial upon return to base. Article 71 covered attempted desertion. Standard procedure required the accused to be held in the forward torpedo room under guard, fed regular rations, and delivered to shore authorities for formal trial. Instead, Braun had ordered Weber sealed into Hold 3, a compartment with no ventilation, no light, no toilet facilities, and no food or water beyond what the commander chose to provide. The boat's cook, Johann Becker, finally broke. He was a Hamburg man, 51 years old, who had been baking bread on U-boats since 1941. He had survived 7 patrols, had earned the U-boat war badge, had done his duty with the grim professionalism of a working-class tradesman doing an impossible job, but he could not live with what he had witnessed. The Capitan ordered me to give Weber 1 cup of water per day, Becker told Thornton, in a voice barely above a whisper. No food. I followed orders for the first week. Weber would scream when I opened the hatch. He begged for food. He showed me the photograph of his wife and son. He said he had only wanted to mail a letter home before the patrol, that he had never intended to desert. But you continued withholding food. Becker's face crumpled. The Capitan said Weber was a traitor, that if I showed mercy I would join him in that compartment. I believed him. On a U-boat, the commander is God. If you disobey, you die, either by his hand or by Allied depth charges because you broke crew discipline. So I gave Weber his cup of water each day and told myself I was following orders. When did you stop giving him water? 20th of April. The Capitan said no more rations would be wasted on a deserter. He ordered the hatch welded shut. Becker's voice broke. I could still hear him screaming for 3 more days. Then he went quiet. I thought he was dead. We all thought he was dead. But the Capitan would not let us check. He said the body would be dealt with when we returned to port. The brutality was systematic. Braun had not acted in rage or panic. He had methodically starved Friedrich Weber to death while continuing military operations, hunting Allied convoys, diving to avoid depth charges, surfacing to recharge batteries. The crew had lived their daily routines with a dying man sealed 15 meters away. They had told jokes, played cards, listened to the radio, eaten their meals, all while Friedrich Weber's screams echoed through the steel hull. Thornton interviewed the junior officers. Oberleutnant zur See Martin Hoffmann, the executive officer, admitted he had questioned Braun's decision. I suggested Weber be held in the torpedo room per regulations, Hoffmann said. The Capitan said regulations were for peacetime, that we were at war, that deserters must be made examples, that mercy was weakness. I did not press the matter. The Capitan's authority was absolute. The boat's engineer, Leitender-Ingenieur Fritz Kramer, described the practical challenges of operating with Hold 3 sealed. "We lost access to critical spare parts," Kramer said. "When the starboard diesel developed a fuel leak on 23rd April, I needed a replacement gasket stored in that compartment. I asked permission to open the hatch. The Capitan refused. I had to fabricate a replacement from canvas and grease. It worked, but barely. The Capitan was willing to risk mechanical failure rather than acknowledge what he had done. The picture that emerged was of a commander who had crossed a line from discipline into sadism, and a crew too conditioned to obey to resist. The Kriegsmarine had built a system where individual conscience was subordinated to command authority, where questioning orders meant death, where humanity was a luxury that could not be afforded inside a steel tube hunting enemy ships in the Atlantic. But there was more to the story. Thornton obtained Weber's personnel file from captured German naval archives. Friedrich Weber, aged 28, had been a baker in civilian life, conscripted into the Kriegsmarine in January 1944. He had completed basic training without incident, been assigned to U-boat service, served on 2 patrols without disciplinary problems. His file contained a letter of commendation from a previous commander, noting his diligent work and positive attitude. So what had changed? Why had Weber suddenly become a deserter? The answer came from Weber himself, now stable enough for brief questioning in the British military hospital. Thornton sat beside his bed. Weber still weighed barely 6 stone, his body a skeleton wrapped in loose skin, and listened as the German sailor spoke in broken English, supplemented by German. "My son was sick," Weber whispered. "My wife sent a telegram to the base at Trondheim. Klaus had pneumonia. The doctors said it was serious. I wanted to see him before we left on patrol. Just 1 hour. I asked the Capitan for permission. He refused. Said personal matters did not justify delay, so I tried to leave the base, just for an hour, to mail a letter, to send money for medicine. The shore patrol caught me at the gate." Thornton felt cold. "That's why Braun punished you? For trying to mail a letter to your sick son?" The Capitan said I had broken trust, that I had chosen family over duty, that such weakness could not be tolerated. He said I would serve as example to the crew of what happens to men who put personal concerns above the boat. Weber's voice dropped to almost nothing. "I never wanted to desert. I just wanted my son to know his father loved him. I wanted to send money so Greta could pay for doctors, that is all. That is why I spent 24 days in darkness." The room was very quiet. Outside, spring rain fell on the ruins of Wilhelmshaven, washing the streets clean of rubble and blood and the debris of defeat. Thornton thought about his own family in Aldershot, about letters from home that had sustained him through Normandy and the Bulge, about the photograph of his younger sister that he carried in his breast pocket. The difference between him and Friedrich Weber was nothing but chance. The accident of birth that made one man British and another German, that put one in the uniform of liberation and the other in the uniform of oppression. "Your son," Thornton said quietly. "Is he dead?" Weber closed his eyes. "The Red Cross confirmed it yesterday. Klaus died of pneumonia on 17th April, 3 days after I was sealed in the hold. While I was screaming for water, my son was dying in Hamburg. My wife thinks I abandoned them. She does not know I tried to come home. She thinks I chose the war over my family." Thornton returned to his office and wrote a second report, this one documenting not just the crime, but the context. The Kriegsmarine's brutal discipline system, the psychology of submarine crews living under constant threat of death, the impossible choice between humanity and duty that Weber had faced. He concluded, "This case represents the logical endpoint of military authority, unchecked by conscience or compassion. Captain Lieutenant Braun did not merely murder a subordinate. He demonstrated what becomes of men when the machinery of war is allowed to operate without moral restraint. At 22:30 hours, word came that formal war crimes charges would be filed. Braun would face a military tribunal. The crew of U-1023 would be held as material witnesses. And Friedrich Weber, if he survived, would return to Hamburg to bury his son and explain to his widow why he had not been there when Klaus died. Thornton walked outside into the rain and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. He thought about the 43 German sailors who had followed orders, who had listened to Weber's screams and done nothing because that was what discipline required. He wondered how many of them would carry that guilt for the rest of their lives, and whether obedience to unjust authority was a defense or an indictment. The war was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The court-martial of Captain Lieutenant Werner Braun convened on the 23rd of June, 1945, in the requisitioned Rathaus of Wilhelmshaven. The prosecution was led by Royal Navy Captain Edmund Blackwood, a barrister from Gray's Inn who had spent the war prosecuting deserters and black marketeers. The defense was provided by Major Wilhelm Schenk of the German Naval Legal Service, a career military lawyer who had defended U-boat commanders in disciplinary proceedings since 1940. Thornton attended as prosecution witness and translator. He sat in the gallery of what had once been the town hall's council chamber, watching British and German officers arrange themselves on opposite sides of a question that went beyond simple murder. Could a military commander be held criminally responsible for enforcing discipline according to his nation's military code, even if that code sanctioned brutality? Braun entered the chamber in naval uniform, stripped of insignia, his bearing still military despite 6 weeks in custody. He was 42 years old, from Kiel, a career naval officer who had earned the Knight's Cross for sinking Allied merchant tonnage in the Atlantic. His record showed 14 successful patrols, 8 ships sunk, over 40,000 tons destroyed. He was precisely the type of efficient, disciplined officer that the Kriegsmarine had prized. And he was, by any reasonable standard, a murderer. The prosecution's case was methodical. Blackwood presented the physical evidence, photographs of Hold 3 showing the filth and cramped conditions, medical reports detailing Weber's injuries, the crude deserter sign that Braun had hung around his prisoner's neck. He called witnesses who testified to the timeline. Weber's confinement beginning 14th April, the welding of the hatch on 20th April, the boat's surrender on 7th May with Weber barely alive. Johann Becker, the cook, testified about delivering the single cup of water per day, about Braun's order to cease all provisions, about the screams that had echoed through the boat. His voice broke repeatedly. "I knew it was wrong," he said, "but the Capitan's word was law. On a U-boat, there is no appeal, no higher authority. You obey, or you die." Oberleutnant Sergei Hoffmann, the executive officer, described questioning Braun's decision and being told that mercy was weakness. The Capitan said that Weber's punishment would serve as deterrent to the entire crew. Hoffmann testified that seeing what happened to deserters would ensure no one else attempted to leave the boat. He said discipline was the only thing keeping us alive in combat, and that any weakening of that discipline would kill us all. The medical testimony was damning. The British Army surgeon who had first examined Weber described injuries consistent with prolonged torture, severe dehydration, starvation, infected wounds from restraints, psychological trauma. This man was systematically destroyed over a period of at least 24 days, the surgeon testified. The suffering he endured would have been unimaginable. That he survived at all is testament to extraordinary physical resilience, but the psychological damage may be permanent. Friedrich Weber himself testified on the 6th day. He was still skeletal, still weak, but strong enough to sit in the witness box and recount his story. His voice was steady as he described his son's illness, his attempt to mail a letter, his arrest by shore patrol. "I never intended to desert," he said. "I wanted only to fulfill my duty as a father. I thought the Capitan would understand. Instead, he made me an example." When asked to describe his time in Hold 3, Weber's composure cracked. "The darkness was absolute. I could not see my hands before my face. The smell of my own waste became normal after the first week. I tried to count the days by listening to the boat's routine, the diving alarm, the crew changing watches, but after a while I could not remember if I was counting days or weeks. I screamed until my voice gave out. I prayed. I thought about my son, and I waited to die. The courtroom was silent. Even Braun, sitting ramrod straight at the defense table, seemed to pale. But the defense had its own narrative. Major Schenk argued that Braun had acted within the scope of Kriegsmarine authority, that military discipline during wartime required harsh measures, that commanders facing life-or-death decisions could not be second-guessed by peacetime standards. Captain Lieutenant Braun commanded a vessel engaged in combat operations against superior enemy forces, Schenk argued. One act of desertion, one breakdown in discipline, could have meant death for the entire crew. He made a command decision that was harsh but necessary. Schenk presented evidence that German military law permitted commanders to exercise summary punishment for desertion during active operations. He cited cases from the Eastern Front where German officers had executed deserters on the spot without trial. He argued that Weber had received more due process than military law required. He had been confined rather than immediately shot, given rations for over a week, marked for potential court-martial upon return to base. The question is not whether Captain Lieutenant Braun's actions were harsh, Schenk said. The question is whether they exceeded his lawful authority as a military commander. And by the standards of the German military code under which he operated, they did not. The courtroom debate exposed a fundamental tension. British military law recognized command authority but limited it through regulations, oversight, and the principle that illegal orders need not be obeyed. German military law, particularly as it had evolved under National Socialist influence, granted commanders near absolute authority, particularly in combat situations. The question was, which legal framework should govern Braun's trial? Captain Blackwood's rebuttal was devastating. The defense argues that Captain Lieutenant Braun acted within German military law, but German military law itself violated the most basic principles of justice and human decency. The defense essentially argues that systematic torture is acceptable if authorized by regulation. This tribunal cannot accept that proposition. There are standards of conduct that transcend national military codes, standards enshrined in the Hague Convention, the Geneva Convention, and basic human morality. He continued, even if we accept that military discipline requires harsh punishment, what Braun did was not discipline, it was sadism. He did not execute Weber swiftly as military law might have permitted. He sealed him in a compartment and slowly starved him to death. He denied him light, sanitation, human contact. He turned Weber's punishment into a spectacle of suffering designed to terrorize the crew. This was not justice. This was torture for its own sake. The tribunal deliberated for 3 days. The verdict, delivered on the 9th of July, found Braun guilty of murder, torture, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The sentence was death by hanging. Braun received the verdict without expression, standing at attention as the president of the tribunal read the findings. But the verdict came with a controversial dissent. One of the 5 tribunal members, a Royal Navy captain who had commanded destroyers in the Atlantic, argued that Braun's conviction set a dangerous precedent. We must be cautious about applying our standards to enemy commanders who operated under different legal frameworks, the dissent read. If we hold enemy officers criminally responsible for enforcing their nation's military codes, we risk creating a situation where any defeated military can be prosecuted for actions that were lawful under their own system. The proper remedy for unjust military codes is political reform, not criminal prosecution of individual commanders. The dissent was overruled, but it raised questions that haunted Thornton. He understood the legal reasoning, that some actions were so fundamentally wrong that they transcended national law. But he also recognized the danger of victors' justice, of holding defeated enemies to standards that the victors might not have applied to themselves. The crew of U-1023 was released without charges. They returned to occupied Germany, to ruined cities and a shattered nation, carrying the knowledge of what they had allowed to happen. Some would speak of their guilt in later years. Most would never mention Friedrich Weber again, burying the memory as they tried to rebuild their lives in a country that no longer existed. The international reaction was muted. The Nuremberg trials were beginning, focused on the Nazi leadership and their crimes against humanity. The case of one U-boat commander who had tortured a subordinate seemed small by comparison. But legal scholars recognized its significance. It established that military discipline itself could constitute a war crime if it violated fundamental human rights, that commanders could not hide behind national military codes to justify brutality. Friedrich Weber returned to Hamburg in August, weighing 7 stone, still unable to walk without assistance. He buried his son in a small cemetery overlooking the Elbe. His wife, Greta, forgave him, eventually. They lived in the British occupation zone, in a city of ruins, raising 2 more children in the shadow of what had been lost. Werner Braun was hanged on the 16th of September 1945 in Hameln prison. His last words, recorded by the attending chaplain, were, "I did my duty as I understood it. That is all any soldier can do." Thornton, reading the execution report in his Aldershot flat after demobilization, wondered if that was true, if doing one's duty was sufficient defense, or if duty itself must be judged by whether it serves humanity or destroys it. The question remained unanswered. But the case file, stamped closed and filed in the archives of the Judge Advocate General's office, stood as testament to what could happen when military authority was allowed to operate without moral constraint, and to the price paid by those who dared to be human in a system that demanded they be machines. 20 years after Friedrich Weber's liberation from Hold 3, historians began piecing together the broader context of military discipline in the Second World War. What emerged was a portrait of systematic brutality across all combatant nations, though degrees varied significantly. The Weber case, once seen as an isolated incident, proved to be representative of a much wider phenomenon: the tension between military necessity and human decency, between discipline and sadism, between following orders and maintaining one's humanity. Research conducted by the Imperial War Museum and German military archives revealed that Weber was far from unique. Across the Kriegsmarine, at least 47 documented cases existed of sailors confined for morale crimes, writing defeatist letters, expressing doubt about victory, attempting to contact families against orders. Most had been held in regulation confinement and faced court-martial, but at least 12 cases resembled Weber's, commanders exercising extrajudicial punishment that crossed into torture. The most striking parallel was U-844, which had been sunk by depth charges in November 1944. When the wreck was finally explored in 1968, divers found skeletal remains shackled in an aft compartment with a corroded metal plate reading "Feigling, coward." The sailor's identity was never determined. He had been sealed in darkness and taken to the bottom when Allied destroyers sent U-844 to the ocean floor. His crime and his name died with him. But the phenomenon was not exclusively German. British military archives, partially declassified in the 1960s, revealed courts-martial records showing brutal treatment of deserters. While British law forbade torture, field punishment number 1, which involved binding men to posts in exposed positions, sometimes under fire, had resulted in deaths that military authorities classified as accidental. The system was different, less systematically brutal, but still capable of destroying men for the crime of breaking under pressure. The American military had executed one soldier, Private Eddie Slovic, for desertion in January 1945, the only such execution of the war. Soviet penal battalions had sent hundreds of thousands of men on suicide missions as punishment for military crimes, political unreliability, or simple bad luck. The Japanese military had practiced systematic brutality against its own troops, including starvation punishment and forced suicide for failure. Military discipline in all armies involved dehumanization. The differences were of degree rather than kind. James Thornton, by then a professor of German history at Oxford, wrote extensively about the Weber case in his landmark 1965 study, Discipline and Destruction, Military Authority in the Second World War. His central argument was that Weber's suffering represented the logical endpoint of military systems that prioritized obedience over conscience, that treated soldiers as instruments rather than human beings, that measured success by efficiency rather than morality. Friedrich Weber's crime was not desertion, Thornton wrote. His crime was being human, loving his son more than he feared his commander, caring about his family more than he cared about military regulations. In a system designed to suppress humanity in favor of mechanical obedience, such love became unforgivable. That he was punished is unsurprising. That his punishment was torture reveals the moral bankruptcy of any military system that cannot distinguish between discipline and sadism. The book sparked controversy. Military establishments in Britain, Germany, and the United States criticized Thornton for undermining respect for military authority and applying peacetime morality to wartime necessity. But younger scholars, many of them veterans of Korea or early Vietnam, found Thornton's analysis compelling. The 1960s were a time of questioning authority, and the Weber case became a touchstone for debates about military obedience, the limits of command authority, and the responsibility of individuals to refuse immoral orders. Friedrich Weber lived until 1978, working as a baker in Hamburg, rarely speaking about his experiences. When journalists sought interviews, he declined. His daughter, Anna, recalled him as a quiet man who struggled with nightmares, but tried to live normally. He told me once that he had survived by forgiving, Anna said in a 1995 oral history interview. Not forgiving Braun. He never forgave Braun, but forgiving the crew, the men who had walked past his sealed compartment every day and done nothing. He said they were victims too, trapped in a system that gave them no choice. If he had hated them, the hatred would have consumed him, so he chose to live instead. Werner Braun's legacy was more complicated. His execution was cited in military legal textbooks as establishing the principle that commanders could face criminal liability for abuse of authority. But Cold War military establishments, both Western and Soviet, quietly resisted this precedent. Commanders needed authority to function effectively. Holding them criminally liable for harsh discipline might undermine military effectiveness. The result was legal ambiguity that persisted for decades. The case also influenced the development of military law. The Uniform Code of Military Justice, implemented by the United States in 1950, included provisions explicitly limiting command authority and establishing soldiers' rights to refuse unlawful orders. British military law underwent similar reforms. The principle that emerged was clear. Military necessity might require harsh discipline, but discipline itself must be bounded by law, subject to oversight, and ultimately accountable to standards of human decency. The boat itself, U-1023, was scuttled in Operation Deadlight, the mass disposal of captured German submarines in late 1945. It was towed to the North Atlantic and sent to the bottom with explosives, along with 116 other U-boats. Hold 3, the compartment where Friedrich Weber had nearly died, filled with seawater and darkness. It rests there still, 3,000 meters down. A steel tomb marking the place where one man's humanity collided with the machinery of total war. In Hamburg, a small memorial plaque was installed in 1995 at the site of the bakery, where Weber had worked before the war. It reads, in German and English, "In memory of Friedrich Weber, 1917–1978, who survived torture by his own commanders for the crime of loving his son. His suffering reminds us that discipline without humanity is tyranny, and that true courage sometimes means refusing to obey. James Thornton attended the memorial's dedication, aged 76, leaning on a cane. He spoke briefly about his role in liberating Weber, about the smell of Hold 3, about the photograph of Klaus that had fallen from Weber's pocket. "I have witnessed many horrors in my life," Thornton said, "but few have taught me more about the capacity for both cruelty and resilience that exists within human beings. Friedrich Weber taught me that survival is not just physical, it is moral." He could have emerged from that darkness consumed by hatred and broken by trauma. Instead, he chose to live, to forgive where forgiveness was possible, and to build a life that honored his son's memory. That is a form of victory more meaningful than any military triumph. The legacy of Hold 3 extends beyond the individuals involved. It stands as a case study in what happens when military systems prioritize obedience over conscience, when commands are followed without moral questioning, when duty becomes divorced from humanity. Every military in the world now teaches the Weber case in some form, using it to illustrate the limits of command authority and the responsibility of individuals to refuse immoral orders. But the deeper lesson is more uncomfortable. The crew of U-1023 were not monsters. They were ordinary men, bakers, mechanics, farmers, pressed into service, trained to obey, and placed in a situation where disobedience meant death. When they walked past Hold 3 and heard Friedrich Weber's screams, they faced an impossible choice: intervene and likely share his fate, or obey their commander and collaborate in torture. Most chose obedience, not because they were evil, but because the system gave them no framework for moral resistance. The question that haunts military ethics to this day is whether we can build military forces that are both effective and humane, that can win wars without destroying the humanity of the soldiers who fight them. The Weber case suggests how difficult that balance is to achieve, and how easily military necessity can become an excuse for systematic brutality. Friedrich Weber's survival was miraculous. His forgiveness was extraordinary. His insistence on living a normal life, despite trauma, was heroic. But the fact that he needed to survive torture inflicted by his own commanders in a military vessel engaged in operations sanctioned by his government reveals the depth of moral failure in military systems that treat soldiers as instruments rather than human beings. The steel walls of Hold 3 are gone now, dissolved by salt water and time in the cold darkness of the Atlantic depths. But the memory remains, not as historical curiosity, but as warning. It reminds us that the greatest threat to human dignity is not always external enemies, but the systems we create ourselves, the orders we follow without questioning, and the authority we grant to those who value discipline more than humanity. 23 years after the war's end, as Thornton wrote the final pages of his study, he returned to a question he had first asked in May 1945. How many other Friedrich Webers had died in sealed compartments, forgotten holds, and dark places across the machinery of war? The honest answer, he concluded, was that we would never know, but that the number was certainly far higher than we wanted to believe. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all, that the capacity for brutality does not belong to any single nation or ideology, but to the systems we create when we prioritize victory over morality, efficiency over compassion, and obedience over conscience. Friedrich Weber survived to tell his story. Countless others did not. Their silence is the most powerful indictment of military systems that forgot what they were supposed to defend: the value of human life, the dignity of the individual, and the principle that some orders must never be obeyed. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to support more untold histories from the Second World War. The men and women who endured these experiences deserve to have their stories remembered. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you know about cases like Friedrich Weber's? What do you think about military discipline and the responsibility to refuse immoral orders? Let's discuss. Ring the bell for notifications so you never miss these powerful, true accounts from history. Thank you for watching and for remembering those who suffered not at the hands of the enemy, but within their own ranks.